Last few years, there has been increasing desire to know whether or not programs work. And so people have been spending lots of money on education programs, health programs, other programs, and people more and more want to know if they work or not. And they're testing them rigorously. And the result of that has been an explosion in high quality evidence on what works to improve learning, what works to get children in school. But the problem is that when you're talking to the Minister of Education or the Minister of Finance in Burundi or Chile, it's not actually useful for them to know the results of one study in Peru or Mongolia. What's useful for them to know is, what does the pattern of evidence tell us? The only way we can do that is by systematically reviewing the literature. There's no other way that we'll be able to really provide answers that are pragmatic and useful. As you look at this evidence, you see dozens of new studies coming out every year, and there's just no way that policymakers and government officials have the space to read all of these studies or necessarily the technical expertise to interpret them. So that's why it's essential that we have people like the people at 3IE and researchers and academics who are examining this array of evidence and telling us, on average, what works, and in specific circumstances, what works. Government policymakers in Burundi need to know what works in countries that face similar institutions to Burundi. And governments in Chile may be looking at a very different set of interventions that are going to be effective. But the only way to figure that out is through systematically reviewing evidence. A couple of years ago, a colleague of mine and I reviewed 6 recent systematic reviews of what works to improve learning in low and middle income countries. So when I first heard about the 3IE review, I'll admit that I was pretty skeptical. Do we really need another one of these? But as I went through the list of studies that were captured in this review, I found that more than 50% of the studies cited came out in just the last 5 years. There is an incredible amount of new evidence coming out every day, so it's essential that we update the synthesis of evidence. This 3IE review is the most expansive. It includes more studies than any systematic review of education that I've looked at. And in addition, it brings a couple of other key assets to bear. One thing that the 3IE review does that other reviews haven't done in nearly so much detail is it examines how programs were implemented. So it's easy to say, oh, we had a teacher incentive program in Kenya, or we had a textbook distribution program in Sierra Leone. But when you examine the facts and you find out that the teacher training program in Kenya wasn't implemented in at all the way that it was planned, and then the results weren't so positive, that's absolutely crucial. It doesn't mean we should turn our back on a teacher training program or a teacher incentive program. What it means is we have to pay attention to institutional realities. What this review does, which is pretty unique, is it gathers as much information as possible on how these interventions were put into place and brings that to bear in how we interpret what will work most effectively in new contexts. Another thing that this review does, which is unique, is it really makes sure to divide interventions into meaningful categories. Many times, reviewers are tempted to use very broad categories and say, on average, do interventions that have teacher training somewhere in them do better than interventions that have computers involved in them? Now, that's not very useful, because in the end, there are a huge number of incredibly effective computing interventions and incredibly ineffective. And so the more detailed we get at the type of intervention, are we talking about one laptop per child, or are we talking about computer-assisted learning? The more detailed we get into that, the more useful the evidence will be for a government that's trying to decide, what kind of information technology should I be incorporating into my education system? What kind of incentives should we be building into our system? The 3IE review does a very nice job of breaking these classes of interventions into their component elements and saying, well, this is what we know specifically about remedial education versus what we know about structured pedagogy. So that's a real contribution.